Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. That's me. And today we're going to talk about how the Reconstruction era sort of changed the South. So our learning targets are to talk about the new Republican control of the state governments, how freedmen adjusted to their new freedom and the role of the Freedmen's Bureau in that. We'll reevaluate the South's new economic system and talk about efforts to limit African American rights and how the federal government intervenes. So by 1870, all of these former Confederate states had met radical Reconstruction requirements and were able to join the Union once again. And Republicans hold firm majorities in all of these state governments. And the reason is that African Americans vote Republican. Heck, they're the party that basically freed the slaves. So why wouldn't African Americans want to join the Republican Party? And because of these millions of new African American voters who take advantage of the 15th Amendment that extended suffrage to them, 1,500 African Americans hold office in state and local governments. There's a black governor. The African Americans hold positions in Congress and the Senate, and they're basically making a lot of policy now. So some whites during this time were not eligible since they had not taken the loyalty oath, and most stayed away from the constitutional conventions because they required African American participation and suffrage. So they did not agree with it. They stay away, and that leads to African Americans being elected into office. And so this leads to other names being called to a lot of people in the South. Scallywags is a negative term for any white Southerner who supports Reconstruction and the radical Republicans. They're called scallywags because they were shut out of politics in the South pre-Civil War, but now they came to power because former Confederates can't vote. And they are kind of put out of power by the carpetbaggers, and most end up in the Redeemer Party, which we'll talk about next time. And the carpetbaggers are any Northerner who moved south after the war in order to sort of take advantage of the South's transitioning period. 60 carpetbaggers are eventually elected to Congress. Most move there wanting to exploit the South during its time of need. Businessmen go and purchase or lease land that was confiscated from Confederate leaders, and they hired new freedmen to work on it. So essentially they are taking advantage of this new form of slavery if they were using sharecroppers, and we'll get into that in just a second. Women in Reconstruction, women take a huge defeat during this time because Republicans argued that they can't pass suffrage for women and blacks at the same time. People wouldn't go for it. So they want to give suffrage to the African American men. So during this time, not getting the right to vote, women in the South work in medical facilities. They work for the Freedmen's Bureau and relief agencies and orphanages. They also establish and help build the foundation of the new tax-supported school system and the freedmen schools in the South. So they come south as teachers. States in the South opt for segregated schools, which would be schools that are separated by race. Some radical Republicans wanted integrated schools, which is where the races would be combined. That's a little too radical for most people. So schooling in the South is very expensive because they have to build two schools. They have to build twice the amount, one for blacks and one for whites. There's also corruption going on in the South because people bribe these politicians in order to receive preferential treatment, and a lot of these bribes come from the railroad industry. Railroads are essential, and they're a new industry in the South because they create jobs for people and they carry goods to markets. So they're kind of two birds with one stone sort of situation. Money is lent to these railroad speculators or people building railroads, but in the South, a lot of the loans are either stolen or mismanaged. And a lot of these instances look bad for Republican and African American politicians because they're deemed as incompetent, ignorant, they don't know what they're doing, and so this will come to harm the Republicans and the African Americans in the South as well. Newly freed slaves have to start their lives from scratch. So because they couldn't get legally married before, a lot of African Americans get legally married now. They're able to live in a home with their entire family and work where they please. A lot of them still work in agriculture, but when they could, some of them become carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, domestic servants. Women work in laundry, they provide childcare, and they do housework. As far as education goes, Freedmen schools fill up with those wanting an education, and African American colleges such as Howard University and Fisk are also established. And religion plays a role as a community center because African Americans can have their own churches now in the South. So new churches are established throughout the South, and they serve as community centers and actually develop leadership of African Americans. A lot of African American leaders began out as ministers. So here is kind of a chart that goes over the three types of land management. I'd like you just to focus on the differences between sharecropping and tenant farming, because share tenancy is kind of a mixture of both. So sharecropping, think of it as basically a legalized form of slavery, or more of indentured servitude eventually, because the landowners supply everything for the sharecroppers: their food, their housing, their tools, and their supplies. Sharecroppers then use those tools and supplies to grow their crop, and at the harvest they give a portion of their crop to the landowner as payment and kept the rest. However, if they would try to sell the rest, it would not be enough to cover what they owed. So then they would have to borrow more, and eventually they would become indebted to their landowners forever, and they just keep that cycle of poverty going. They don't own the crops or the land in this system. In tenant farming, think of a tenant as somebody in an apartment building who just lives there and they are renting the space. So tenant farmers basically rent the land from the farmer. They provide all of their own farm tools and supplies. They rent the land and the rights to work it, and they grow their crop, and they're able to sell it and then save their money and purchase their own land at that point. And then share tenancy is kind of a mixture of the two. But just focus on the difference between sharecropping and tenant farming. You can screenshot this if you would like to add it to your notes. New challenges in the South. Not everybody is all hunky-dory about these new African American rights, and a lot of those people join the Ku Klux Klan, who is an organization that has the goals of scaring off these freed people from voting using a lot of terror tactics, such as burning homes, beating and killing blacks and their white supporters, burning black schools and black churches. And in rural areas, the tactics are pretty successful, and the people don't want to vote because then they know they'll be targets of the Ku Klux Klan. So in order to curb this violence, Congress goes ahead and passes the Enforcement Acts in response to the violence. And the Enforcement Acts basically make it illegal to interfere with a citizen's right to vote. And we'll talk more about more court cases next time. But for now, the Enforcement Acts are an act of Congress that make it illegal to interfere with the citizen's right to vote. That's all I have for you this time. Go ahead and fill out your learning targets. Bring any questions you have for me to class, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.